They called me a crazy old woman, fired me in front of 300 people, and told me I'd never work again, all because I saved a man from losing everything he'd built. I can still feel my hands shaking as I remember standing in that boardroom, surrounded by men in expensive suits who looked at me like I was dirt on their shoes. The humiliation burned through my chest like acid. My face was on fire with shame as 3 security guards escorted me past hundreds of employees who whispered and stared. At 64 years old, after working my fingers to the bone for 3 years, I was being thrown out like yesterday's garbage. I'm Linda Patterson, and I'm here in my cozy kitchen in Toledo, Ohio, 70 years old now, and finally ready to tell you the truth about what really happened at Meridian Industries. The coffee's brewing, the morning sun is streaming through my lace curtains, and I've got all day to share with you the most incredible story of betrayal, courage, and justice you've ever heard. See, what those fancy executives didn't know was that this crazy old cleaning lady had been gathering evidence for months. While they plotted their billion-dollar fraud in their glass offices, I was emptying their trash cans and listening to every word. While they dismissed me as invisible, I was building a case that would bring their whole corrupt empire crashing down. But that morning, when I whispered those 4 words, "Don't sign, it's a trap," to the young CEO, I had no idea it would cost me everything I had left in this world: my job, my dignity, my reputation. They made sure every person in that building thought I was a delusional old fool who'd finally lost her mind. What they didn't count on was that this grandmother had been through hell before and learned never to give up. I'd buried a husband, raised 3 children on my own, and survived poverty that would break most people. A bunch of greedy corporate criminals in $1,000 suits? Honey, they picked the wrong woman to mess with. Tell me in the comments what you're doing right now while you listen to my story. Are you having your morning coffee like me, folding laundry, or maybe taking a quiet moment for yourself? Hit that like button because each like is so important to help my voice reach other women who need to hear this. And subscribe to Grandma's Legacy because no woman should ever feel alone when powerful people try to silence her truth. Now I need you to understand something before I continue. What I discovered in those trash cans and overheard in those late-night meetings wasn't just some minor office politics. This was a conspiracy so massive, so carefully planned, that it involved forged contracts, hidden debts worth millions, and a betrayal that went straight to the heart of everything that young CEO had built with his own hands. The 2 people orchestrating this fraud? His best friend since college and his manipulative ex-girlfriend who'd been playing a long game for years. And when I tried to save him from losing everything, they turned the entire company against me with lies so convincing that even I started to question my own sanity. But honey, what happened next will show you exactly what an underestimated grandmother can accomplish when she decides she's had enough of being pushed around. Let me take you back to 2019 when I first walked through those gleaming glass doors of Meridian Industries in downtown Cleveland. I was 64 years old, a recent widow trying to figure out how to survive on Social Security after losing my Harold to cancer the year before. Those were different times back then. The economy was booming, young tech entrepreneurs were making millions overnight, and buildings like Meridian's 40-story tower represented everything successful about modern America. But for women like me, the working poor in our 60s, it was still a struggle to find decent employment that didn't break our aging backs. Harold and I had been married 42 years. He was a mechanic at the Ford plant, and I'd worked various jobs: school secretary, department store clerk, restaurant hostess, whatever paid the bills and fit around raising our 3 kids. We never had much, but we had each other and a little ranch house on Elm Street with a garden where I grew the most beautiful tomatoes in the neighborhood. When the cancer took Harold, it took everything else too. Medical bills ate up our savings. The house needed repairs I couldn't afford, and his pension wasn't enough to cover the mortgage and groceries. My children tried to help, but they had families of their own and their own financial struggles in this expensive world. That's how I found myself answering a Craigslist ad for evening cleaning services, mature, reliable applicants preferred. Meridian Industries was looking for night janitors, And at 64, I figured I was about as mature as they come. The pay was $12 an hour, not great, but honest work, and the night shift meant I could avoid the worst of the arthritis pain that flared up in the mornings. My supervisor was a kind Puerto Rican woman named Maria Santos, about 55, who understood what it meant to work hard for every dollar. She trained me on my first week, showing me the routes through each floor, explaining which offices needed extra attention, and most importantly, teaching me the golden rule of corporate cleaning. Mija, we are invisible to these people. They talk like we don't exist, so we clean quietly and we never repeat what we hear. But here's what Maria didn't know. I'd been invisible my whole life. Growing up poor in rural Ohio in the 1950s, being the mechanic's wife, the school secretary, nobody noticed. I'd learned that invisible people see and hear everything, and sometimes that's more powerful than being seen. Meridian Industries was the crown jewel of CEO Michael Harrison's empire. At 38, he was the kind of golden boy American success story that magazines loved to write about. Self-made millionaire who'd started with nothing but a computer and a dream, built a technology consulting firm that handled contracts for major corporations across the Midwest. His office on the 40th floor had windows overlooking Lake Erie, leather furniture that cost more than my annual salary, and photographs of him shaking hands with politicians and celebrities. But what struck me most about Michael Harrison wasn't his wealth. It was how respectfully he treated the cleaning staff. While other executives wouldn't even make eye contact, he'd nod and say, "Good evening, Mrs. Patterson," when he worked late. He knew my name. He asked about my grandchildren. Small kindnesses, but they meant everything to a woman who'd spent years being overlooked. His inner circle consisted of 2 people he trusted completely. James Mitchell had been his roommate at Ohio State University, his best man at his wedding, and was now the chief financial officer. A tall, smooth-talking man with silver hair and expensive suits who always seemed to be juggling multiple phone calls about deals and investments. Then there was Rebecca Stevens, his director of strategic partnerships, and his ex-girlfriend from about 5 years earlier. A stunning brunette in her early 30s who dressed like she stepped off magazine covers and spoke with the kind of confidence that comes from always getting what you want. Their breakup had been amicable, or so everyone believed, and Michael had been happy to keep her in a key position because she was brilliant at her job. What nobody knew, not even Michael, was that James and Rebecca had been having a secret affair for over 2 years. I discovered this completely by accident one evening when I walked into the conference room and found them in a very compromising position on the mahogany table. They didn't even see me. I backed out quietly and never mentioned it to anyone. But that night changed everything because I started paying closer attention to their interactions. The way James would linger when Rebecca was talking. How she'd smile at him when Michael wasn't looking. The late-night meetings that seemed to happen more frequently when the boss was out of town. I had no idea these 2 were planning something that would nearly destroy everything Michael had worked his entire adult life to build. But I was about to find out just how dangerous it can be when an invisible cleaning lady starts seeing too much. The first real warning sign came on a Thursday evening in October 2019, about 6 months after I'd started working at Meridian. I was emptying the wastebaskets in the executive conference room when I heard raised voices coming from James Mitchell's office down the hall. "The numbers don't add up, James. We're showing profits that don't match our actual contracts." Michael's voice carried that edge of concern I'd learned to recognize. He was meticulous about his business, the kind of man who read every document and questioned every discrepancy. "Mike, relax. It's just an accounting adjustment. Rebecca found some contracts we hadn't properly categorized. Everything's above board." James's smooth voice had that practiced quality of someone used to explaining things away. I should have kept moving, kept cleaning, stayed invisible like Maria taught me. But something in James's tone made me pause. In my 64 years, I'd heard that particular brand of confidence before, from the used car salesman who sold Harold a lemon, from the insurance adjuster who tried to deny Harold's cancer claim, from the funeral director who inflated costs when I was too grief-stricken to think straight. It was the voice of a man who thought he was smarter than everyone around him. Over the following weeks, I started noticing things that didn't sit right. Late-night meetings between James and Rebecca when Michael was traveling. Hushed phone conversations that stopped abruptly when someone else entered the room. Documents left on desks that mentioned companies I'd never heard of. With Michael's signature on contracts he couldn't have possibly reviewed because he'd been out of the office those days. One night in November, I was cleaning Rebecca's office when I noticed she'd left her computer unlocked. Something that never happened. The screen showed an email exchange between her and someone named David Chen discussing Phase 2 implementation and ensuring the target remains unaware until completion. The language was vague, but the tone was unmistakably conspiratorial. I knew I should look away, mind my own business, focus on my cleaning, but something about those words, target and remains unaware, sent chills down my spine. In all my years of being invisible, I'd developed good instincts about when people were planning something harmful. That's when I started taking pictures with my old flip phone. Not of confidential documents, I'm not a criminal, but of things like meeting schedules showing James and Rebecca together when they claimed to be working on separate projects. Email timestamps that proved they were coordinating activities Michael didn't know about. Small pieces of evidence that might mean nothing individually, but together painted a troubling picture. The conspiracy became clearer in December when I overheard a phone conversation that changed everything. Rebecca was in her office around 11 p.m., speaking in the kind of hushed, urgent tone people use when they're discussing secrets. David, the merger documents are almost ready. James has been brilliant with the financial restructuring. Michael will never see the hidden debt transfers until it's too late. There was a pause as she listened. Yes, the Cleveland property is already in our names. Once he signs the Hartwell Industries deal, we'll control 60% of his assets without him realizing it. My blood ran cold. I'd heard Michael discussing the Hartwell merger for months. It was supposed to be his company's biggest expansion, a billion-dollar deal that would cement Meridian Industries as a major player in the tech consulting world. But what Rebecca was describing wasn't a merger. It was a hostile takeover disguised as a partnership. I started staying late, volunteering for extra hours, positioning myself to overhear more conversations. What I discovered was breathtaking in its audacity and cruelty. James had been creating shell companies using Michael's forged signature, moving assets out of Meridian and into accounts he controlled with Rebecca. The Hartwell merger was the final piece, a carefully crafted trap that would leave Michael personally liable for millions in hidden debts while his supposed best friend and ex-girlfriend walked away with his life's work. But the most heartbreaking part was discovering why they were doing this. It wasn't just greed, though, that was certainly part of it. Rebecca had never gotten over Michael choosing to end their relationship, and she'd spent years planning this elaborate revenge. She'd seduced James, convinced him that Michael had never appreciated their contributions, that they deserved to own what they'd helped build. "He thinks he's so much smarter than us," she told James during one late-night planning session I accidentally overheard while cleaning the adjacent office. Mr. Golden Boy with his perfect reputation and his loyal employees. Wait until he realizes his best friend and the woman he trusted most have been planning this for 2 years. The cruelty in her voice made me physically sick. I'd watched Michael work 18-hour days, seen him take pay cuts to avoid laying off employees during tough months, witnessed him personally visit the hospital when Maria's husband had his heart attack. He was a good man who trusted the wrong people, and they were going to destroy him for sport. By January 2020, I had enough evidence to fill a shoebox. Photographs, notes about conversations, documentation of meetings, and financial discrepancies. But I was just a cleaning lady. Who would believe me over a CFO and a director of strategic partnerships? How could I convince anyone that 2 respected executives were planning to steal a company from under their friend's nose? Then I learned that the Hartwell merger was scheduled to be signed on February 14, 2020, Valentine's Day. Rebecca's twisted sense of humor, no doubt. Michael would unknowingly sign away his company on the day of love, betrayed by the two people he cared about most in the business world. I had less than 3 weeks to figure out how to save a man who barely knew I existed from people who were supposed to love him. The clock was ticking, and this 64-year-old widow was the only thing standing between Michael Harrison and total destruction. What I decided to do next would either save his company or destroy what little life I had left. February 14th, 2020, Valentine's Day, the day that would either save Michael Harrison or destroy us both. I arrived at Meridian Industries that morning, 3 hours before my shift started, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it echoing in the empty lobby. In my purse was every piece of evidence I'd gathered over 4 months: photographs, notes, even audio recordings I'd managed to capture on my ancient flip phone when James and Rebecca thought they were alone. The signing ceremony was scheduled for 10 a.m. in the main conference room. Hartwell Industries executives would be flying in from Detroit. Lawyers would have their documents ready, and Michael would unknowingly sign papers that would transfer control of his life's work to the two people who'd been systematically betraying him for years. I spent those early morning hours cleaning the executive floor with shaking hands, going over my plan again and again. Maria had called in sick, so I was working alone, which was perfect because I couldn't involve her in what I was about to do. This sweet woman had a family to protect, and what I was planning could get us both fired or worse. Around 9:30 a.m., people started arriving. Hartwell Industries' team looked like they'd stepped out of a corporate magazine. Perfectly pressed suits, expensive briefcases, the kind of confident demeanor that comes from handling billion-dollar deals. James was in his element, playing the charming host, while Rebecca orchestrated everything with the precision of a military operation. Michael looked nervous but excited. This merger represented everything he'd dreamed about when he started Meridian Industries from his garage 15 years earlier. I watched him reviewing documents one last time, trusting that his best friend and the woman he'd once loved had his best interests at heart. At 9:45 a.m., I made my decision. I walked into that conference room carrying my cleaning supplies, just another invisible old woman doing her job. 23 people in expensive suits barely glanced at me as I began emptying wastebaskets and wiping down surfaces. But when I reached Michael's chair, I leaned down and whispered 4 words that changed everything. "Don't sign, it's a trap." The reaction was immediate and devastating. Michael looked up at me with confusion and surprise, while James Mitchell's face went white as a sheet. Rebecca recovered quickly, laughing that practiced, dismissive laugh I'd heard her use on subordinates she considered beneath her notice. "I'm so sorry, everyone," Rebecca announced to the room with theatrical embarrassment. "Linda is one of our cleaning staff. She's been having some episodes lately. We've been concerned about her mental health. If you're feeling the anger and betrayal building in this room right now, show your support, hit that like button, comment if you've ever been dismissed and underestimated, and subscribe because we strong women need to stick together when powerful people try to silence our truth." James quickly joined in, his voice filled with fake concern. "Linda, you shouldn't be working today. Why don't you go home and rest?" But I could see the panic in his eyes, the way his hands were trembling as he realized his perfect plan might be falling apart. "Mr. Harrison," I said, ignoring everyone else in the room, "please ask your friend James about the shell companies registered under your forged signature. Ask Rebecca about the hidden debt transfers and why 60% of your assets will belong to them once you sign these papers." The room erupted. The Hartwell executives exchanged worried glances. James jumped to his feet, his smooth composure finally cracking. "This is ridiculous. Security needs to remove this woman immediately." But Michael held up his hand. Something in my voice, maybe the desperate honesty of a woman with nothing left to lose, made him pause. "What shell companies, Linda?" I reached into my cleaning cart and pulled out my shoebox of evidence. Months of careful documentation that proved everything I was claiming. Photographs of documents, recordings of conversations, timestamps that showed James and Rebecca had been meeting secretly for years. "These people have been stealing from you since 2018, I said, my voice growing stronger despite the hostile stares surrounding me. They've moved millions of dollars into accounts they control. This merger isn't an expansion, it's a takeover. They're going to leave you bankrupt while they walk away with everything you've built. Rebecca's mask finally slipped. The polished, professional woman disappeared, replaced by someone filled with cold fury. You pathetic old woman. You're a nobody, a minimum-wage janitor who empties trash cans for a living. Nobody in this room is going to believe your paranoid fantasies over two respected executives. Then explain this, I said, pulling out my phone and playing an audio recording of her conversation with David Chen about Phase 2 implementation and ensuring the target remains unaware. The silence in that room was deafening. Michael's face had gone pale as he began recognizing the voices of his two most trusted advisors, discussing his destruction with casual cruelty. The Hartwell executives were gathering their papers, clearly uncomfortable with the direction this meeting had taken. James made one last, desperate attempt to control the situation. "Michael, you can't seriously be listening to this. Look at her." He gestured dismissively in my direction. "She's a crazy old cleaning lady who's obviously having some kind of breakdown. We need to call security and get her psychiatric help." But Michael was already reaching for the evidence I'd collected, his business instincts finally overriding his personal loyalty. As he examined the photographs and documentation, I watched his face transform from confusion to recognition to absolute devastation. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, staring at a document showing his forged signature on a contract he'd never seen. "This is real. You two have been... for how long?" 2 years, 8 months, and 16 days, I said quietly. "I have it all documented." That's when Rebecca made her final, fatal mistake. Instead of continuing to deny everything, her rage took over completely. "You have no idea what you've just done, you stupid old bitch. We'll destroy you for this. We'll make sure you never work again, never have a peaceful moment, never. Rebecca, stop." Michael's voice cut through her tirade like ice. "Just stop." The woman who'd planned to steal his company on Valentine's Day had just confessed to everything in front of 20 witnesses, including lawyers and executives from another corporation. But what came next would prove that exposing the truth was only the beginning of my nightmare. The conference room exploded into chaos. Hartwell Industries executives were packing up their briefcases and heading for the door, clearly wanting no part of whatever corporate drama they'd stumbled into. Lawyers were making urgent phone calls, and I could hear someone mentioning SEC investigation and fraud charges. But James Mitchell wasn't going down without a fight. The smooth-talking CFO, who'd spent 2 years planning this elaborate betrayal, transformed into something desperate and dangerous right before my eyes. "Michael, listen to me," James said, his voice taking on the urgent tone of a man whose world was collapsing. "This woman is clearly unstable. Look at her. She's a 64-year-old janitor who's obviously having some kind of mental breakdown. She's been obsessed with you for months, following you around, making up these elaborate fantasies." I watched him work, using every manipulation technique in the book. He was trying to gaslight Michael, make him question what he'd just heard with his own ears, and for a moment I saw doubt creep into Michael's expression. After all, who would you believe, your best friend since college or the cleaning lady nobody notices? That's when I realized I had to take the biggest gamble of my life. Everything I'd worked for, all the evidence I'd gathered, would mean nothing if I couldn't convince Michael to trust a woman he barely knew over people he'd considered family. "Mr. Harrison," I said, stepping forward with my shoebox of evidence. "I understand why this is hard to believe, but I need you to call your bank right now and ask them about any accounts opened in your name that you didn't authorize. Ask them about transfers from Meridian Industries to companies called Hartwell Strategic Holdings, Mitchell Financial Services, and Stevens Development Group." The color drained from James's face. Those were the exact names of the shell companies he'd created using Michael's forged signature, and he realized that this crazy old cleaning lady, knew details that would be impossible to make up. Rebecca tried a different approach. Linda, we know you've been struggling financially since your husband died. Maybe we can work something out, help you with your medical bills, find you a better position in the company. There's no need to continue this misunderstanding. She was trying to bribe me, right there in front of everyone. The arrogance was breathtaking. She actually thought she could buy off a woman who'd spent months gathering evidence of their crimes. I don't want your money, I said firmly. I want justice for a good man who trusted the wrong people. Michael was already on his phone with the bank, and I watched his face grow more ashen with each question he asked. When was that account opened? I never authorized. How much was transferred? That's impossible. I would have known about. When he hung up, his hands were shaking. There are accounts in my name containing over $8 million that I never opened. Transfers from Meridian dating back 18 months. He looked at James with the expression of a man whose entire world had just collapsed. How could you do this to me? I trusted you with everything. James's composure finally shattered completely. You trusted me? You mean you used me? Do you think I enjoyed being your sidekick for 15 years while you got all the credit? Do you know what it's like watching your best friend become a millionaire while you're still taking orders and living in his shadow? The truth was pouring out now. Years of resentment and jealousy that had festered into this elaborate betrayal. But Rebecca was smarter than James, and she could see that their plan was falling apart. She started moving toward the door, probably hoping to escape before someone called the police. Oh no, you don't, I said, stepping between her and the exit. At 64 years old, I wasn't about to let this woman walk away from the destruction she'd caused. Get out of my way, you pathetic old witch! Rebecca snarled, showing her true nature for the first time since I'd known her. Make me, I replied, drawing on every ounce of strength I'd learned from 42 years of marriage to a working-class man and raising 3 children on tight budgets. I'd dealt with bullies before, and this corporate princess didn't scare me. That's when Michael finally found his voice. Security, I need you in conference room A immediately, and someone call the police. I want these 2 arrested for fraud, embezzlement, and whatever other charges apply to stealing from your business partner. James made one last, desperate play. Michael, wait. Let's think about this rationally. If this goes public, it'll destroy Meridian Industries. The scandal will ruin your reputation, your stock price will tank, your employees will lose their jobs. Is that really what you want? It was a clever manipulation, making Michael feel responsible for the consequences of exposing their crimes. But I'd learned something about Michael Harrison during my months of invisibly observing him, and I knew he was better than that. Mr. Harrison, I said quietly, sometimes doing the right thing costs everything, but doing the wrong thing costs your soul. Michael looked at me, really looked at me for perhaps the first time since I'd started working at Meridian. I saw something shift in his expression. A recognition that this invisible cleaning lady had more integrity in her little finger than his 2 most trusted advisors had in their entire bodies. James, Rebecca, he said with a quiet dignity that made me proud, you're fired. Security will escort you out, and if you're not under arrest by tonight, it'll only be because the prosecutors need more time to prepare their case. But as security guards entered the conference room and began reading James and Rebecca their rights, I realized that my victory was about to become my punishment. These 2 weren't going down without taking me with them, and what they did next would nearly destroy the last years of my life. Within 24 hours of exposing the conspiracy, my life became a living hell. James Mitchell and Rebecca Stevens didn't go quietly. Even as they were being arrested for fraud and embezzlement, they launched a coordinated attack on my credibility that was as sophisticated as their original plan to steal Michael's company. If they were going down, they were determined to take the crazy old cleaning lady who'd ruined everything with them. Rebecca's lawyer, a sharp-dressed woman from a prestigious Cleveland firm, held a press conference that afternoon. My client is the victim of a disturbed individual who has been stalking her workplace and fabricating evidence as part of an elaborate delusion. Linda Patterson is a mentally unstable widow who became obsessed with CEO Michael Harrison and created this fantasy to insert herself into his life. The story spread like wildfire through Cleveland's business community. Local news stations picked it up, social media exploded with speculation, and suddenly I was the center of a media circus I never wanted or asked for. Reporters showed up at my little house on Elm Street, shoving microphones in my face and asking if I was taking medication for my psychiatric condition. But the worst part was what happened at Meridian Industries itself. James and Rebecca had spent years cultivating relationships with employees, painting themselves as the loyal partners who really ran the company, while Michael got all the credit. Many employees refused to believe that their popular CFO and beloved strategic director were capable of such elaborate betrayal. Maria Santos pulled me aside on my first day back to work, her kind face filled with worry. "Mija, people are saying terrible things. They're saying you made all this up because you have a crush on Mr. Harrison, that you planted fake documents in the trash cans. Some are calling you a liar, others are saying you need psychiatric help." The whispers followed me through every hallway. Employees who'd barely noticed me for months now stared openly as I cleaned their offices. I heard fragments of conversations. "Can you believe they're keeping her on staff after what she did?" And, "I feel sorry for her, but she's obviously delusional." And, "Someone that unstable shouldn't be around important documents." 3 days after the arrests, Michael called me into his office. He looked exhausted, aged a decade in the span of a week. The FBI had frozen most of his accounts pending their investigation, reporters were camped outside his house, and his company's stock price had dropped 40% as news of the scandal spread. "Linda, I need you to know how grateful I am for what you did," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of everything he'd lost. The FBI confirmed that James and Rebecca had indeed stolen over $12 million, and they were planning to take much more through the Hartwell merger. "You saved my company." But then came the words I'd been dreading. "However, I'm going to have to let you go. Not because I don't believe you or appreciate what you did, but because your presence here has become disruptive. Employees are uncomfortable, productivity is down, and I need to focus on rebuilding after this scandal." I felt my heart breaking all over again. After sacrificing everything to save this man's company, I was being fired anyway, not for lying or being unstable, but for being inconvenient. The very visibility that had allowed me to expose the truth now made me a liability. "I understand, Mr. Harrison," I managed to say, though the words felt like glass in my throat. "I never wanted to cause problems for you or your company." He handed me a severance check. Generous, but not nearly enough to make up for the reputation damage I'd suffered. "Linda, I know this isn't fair. If there's ever anything I can do to help you." But what could he do? How do you repair the reputation of a 64-year-old woman who'd been publicly labeled as mentally unstable by high-powered lawyers? How do you convince potential employers that you're trustworthy when news articles describe you as a delusional stalker who fabricated evidence? The next 6 months were the darkest of my life since Harold's death. No cleaning company in Cleveland would hire me. Rebecca's smear campaign had been too effective. I applied for retail jobs, restaurant work, even tried to get hired at grocery stores. But everywhere I went, someone had seen the news stories about the crazy cleaning lady from Meridian Industries. My savings dwindled. I had to take out a reverse mortgage on the house Harold and I had worked so hard to pay off. My own children started questioning my version of events, wondering if maybe the stress of widowhood had affected my judgment more than I wanted to admit. But the worst moments came late at night when I'd lie in bed wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake. Maybe I should have minded my own business, stayed invisible, let Michael Harrison sign those papers, and deal with the consequences later. At least then I'd still have my job, my dignity, and my peaceful anonymity. James Mitchell and Rebecca Stevens were released on bail within a week, their expensive lawyers arguing that they were flight risks, but deserving of freedom pending trial. They were back on Cleveland's social scene within a month, attending charity galas and maintaining their innocence, while I was struggling to afford groceries. But what James, Rebecca, and their lawyers didn't know was that this stubborn old grandmother wasn't finished fighting. While they were celebrating their temporary freedom and my apparent defeat, I was planning something that would ensure justice was finally served. For 6 months, I lived like a ghost in my own city. But sometimes being invisible is exactly what you need to gather the evidence that will change everything. While James Mitchell and Rebecca Stevens were making the rounds at Cleveland society parties, confident that they'd successfully destroyed my credibility, I was working the night shift at a truck stop diner 50 miles outside the city. It wasn't glamorous work, serving coffee and pie to long-haul drivers at 3 in the morning, but it paid just enough to keep my house and gave me the anonymity I needed to continue my real work. Because here's what those arrogant criminals didn't understand. You can ruin a woman's reputation, but you can't change the facts. And the facts were sitting in evidence rooms at the FBI and the Cleveland District Attorney's Office, waiting for their day in court. I used those lonely months to do something I'd never had time for before. I educated myself about financial fraud, corporate law, and the criminal justice system. I spent hours at the public library, reading everything I could find about embezzlement cases, studying how prosecutors built their arguments, learning the language of justice. But more importantly, I discovered that I wasn't alone. Through online forums for fraud victims and support groups for people who'd been targeted by corporate retaliation, I met others who'd been dismissed, silenced, and discredited for telling inconvenient truths. Women who'd exposed sexual harassment and been labeled as troublemakers. Whistleblowers who'd revealed safety violations and been branded as disgruntled employees. We formed our own little network of stubborn truth-tellers who refused to give up. One of those women was Margaret Chen, yes, sister to the David Chen, who'd been Rebecca's contact in setting up the shell companies. Margaret was a retired accountant who'd suspected her brother was involved in something shady but couldn't prove it until she heard my story on a podcast about corporate whistleblowing. "Linda," she told me during one of our late-night phone conversations, "David has been living way beyond his means for the past 2 years. Expensive cars, designer clothes, a condo in Miami he shouldn't be able to afford on his stated income. If the FBI digs deeper into his finances, they'll find the money trail that connects him directly to James and Rebecca." That information became crucial when the federal trial finally began in January 2021. The prosecutors had built their case around the financial documents I'd provided, but they needed to prove that the fraud was part of a larger conspiracy, not just a crime of opportunity by 2 disgruntled employees. I'll never forget walking into that federal courthouse in downtown Cleveland to testify. After months of being portrayed as a delusional old woman, I was finally going to tell my story under oath, where lying carries serious consequences. James and Rebecca's lawyers had spent a year trying to discredit me, but they couldn't discredit the evidence itself. The lead prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Martinez, was a sharp woman in her 40s who understood exactly what I'd been through. "Mrs. Patterson," she said during my testimony, "the defense has suggested that you fabricated this evidence because of a romantic obsession with Mr. Harrison. What's your response to that accusation?" I looked directly at the jury, 12 ordinary people who looked like they could be my neighbors, my children, my friends from church, and spoke from my heart. "Your Honor, I was married to the same wonderful man for 42 years. I know what love looks like, and I know what justice looks like. What I did wasn't about romance, it was about right and wrong. And what James Mitchell and Rebecca Stevens did was wrong." The trial lasted 3 weeks. Every day, I sat in that courtroom watching the evidence I'd carefully gathered over months being presented to the jury. Bank records, audio recordings, forged documents, testimony from FBI forensic accountants who'd traced the money through the shell companies, everything I'd risked my reputation and livelihood to collect. James Mitchell's lawyer tried one last, desperate strategy during cross-examination. "Mrs. Patterson, isn't it true that you were facing financial difficulties after your husband's death? Couldn't this elaborate story be motivated by a desire for the reward money often given to corporate whistleblowers?" "Sir," I replied, looking him straight in the eye, "I never asked for a penny of reward money. I just wanted to stop two people from destroying a good man who trusted them. If that makes me crazy, then I'm proud to be crazy. The jury deliberated for 8 hours. When they returned with guilty verdicts on all counts, conspiracy, fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Harold's death. Complete vindication. James Mitchell was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. Rebecca Stevens got 10 years. David Chen, who'd cooperated with prosecutors, received 5 years and had to forfeit the Miami condo and luxury cars he'd bought with stolen money. But the real victory came 2 weeks later when Michael Harrison called me personally. "Linda, I owe you an apology that's probably 15 months overdue. I let public pressure and business concerns override what I knew in my heart was true, that you're one of the most honest, courageous people I've ever met." He offered me a position as Director of Corporate Ethics at Meridian Industries, a role specifically created to ensure that what happened with James and Rebecca could never happen again. The salary was more money than I'd ever imagined earning, with full benefits and a retirement package that would secure my future. More importantly, he asked me to speak at corporate conferences about the importance of listening to all employees, regardless of their position in the company hierarchy. "You saw what trained executives, auditors, and lawyers all missed," he told me. "Organizations need people who aren't afraid to speak truth to power." Within a year, I'd spoken at conferences in Chicago, Detroit, New York, and Atlanta. My story was featured in Harvard Business Review and Forbes, not as the delusional cleaning lady Rebecca's lawyers had portrayed, but as a case study in corporate whistleblowing and the value of ethical leadership. I moved from my little house on Elm Street to a beautiful condo overlooking Lake Erie, with panoramic windows and a kitchen where I can watch the sunrise while having my morning coffee. My children, who'd spent months worrying about my mental health, now bragged to their friends about their mother who took down white-collar criminals and testified in federal court. The speaking engagements led to something I never expected: a book deal. The Invisible Woman: How a Cleaning Lady Exposed Corporate America's Biggest Fraud became a bestseller within 6 months. The advance alone was enough to pay off my house completely and set up college funds for my 5 grandchildren. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came last spring when I received a letter from a young woman in Seattle who'd heard me speak at a conference. She was a night shift security guard who'd discovered financial irregularities at her company and was afraid to report them because she was worried about retaliation. "Mrs. Patterson," she wrote, "your story gave me the courage to speak up. Because of your example, I reported what I found to the authorities, and we stopped a fraud that could have cost hundreds of people their retirement savings. Thank you for showing me that invisible women can change the world." That letter is framed on my kitchen wall next to a photograph of Harold and me on our 40th wedding anniversary. Every morning when I see it, I'm reminded that sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to stay silent when you witness injustice. At 70 years old, I have a career I never dreamed of, financial security I never expected, and the respect of people who once dismissed me as irrelevant. But more than any of that, I have the knowledge that when it mattered most, I found the courage to do the right thing. James Mitchell and Rebecca Stevens thought they could silence an old woman by destroying her reputation and threatening her livelihood. What they discovered instead is that you can't stop someone who has nothing left to lose except their integrity. And that's the one thing I was never willing to give up. My life at 70 is nothing like I imagined it would be when I was emptying those trash cans at Meridian Industries. But sometimes the best chapters of your story come when you least expect them, when you're brave enough to speak truth to power and refuse to let injustice win. As I sit here in my beautiful kitchen this morning, watching the sun rise over Lake Erie and sipping coffee from a mug that says "World's Most Dangerous Cleaning Lady," a gift from my granddaughter who's incredibly proud of her badass grandma, I want to share the most important lessons I've learned from this incredible journey. First, never underestimate the power of being underestimated. For 64 years, I was the invisible woman, the mechanic's wife, the school secretary, the cleaning lady nobody noticed. But that invisibility became my superpower when I needed it most. While James and Rebecca were busy plotting in their glass offices, assuming that no one important was watching, I was gathering every piece of evidence they carelessly left behind. Second, trust your instincts about people. When something doesn't feel right, when someone's words don't match their actions, when you sense deception beneath a polished surface, pay attention to that feeling. Your gut is usually smarter than your head, especially when it comes to recognizing dishonesty. I knew James Mitchell was lying long before I could prove it, simply because his smooth explanations reminded me of every con artist I'd ever encountered. Third, integrity isn't about what people think of you. It's about what you can live with when you look in the mirror. There were so many moments when I could have walked away, stayed silent, minded my own business. When Rebecca's lawyers were calling me mentally unstable, when my own children questioned my judgment, when I was struggling to pay bills and wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake, it would have been easier to admit I was wrong and fade back into invisibility. But I couldn't live with myself knowing that a good man was about to lose everything to people who claimed to love him while planning his destruction. I couldn't stay silent while watching elaborate cruelty disguised as friendship and partnership. Some things are more important than personal comfort, and stopping injustice is one of them. Fourth, never give up on justice, even when the system seems stacked against you. It took 18 months from the day I first whispered, "Don't sign, it's a trap," to the day James and Rebecca were sentenced to federal prison. 18 months of being called crazy, delusional, and unstable. 18 months of watching them walk free while I struggled to find work and maintain my dignity. But the truth has a way of rising to the surface, no matter how many people try to bury it. Evidence speaks louder than expensive lawyers. Facts matter more than spin campaigns. And sometimes, all it takes is one stubborn grandmother who refuses to be silenced to bring down an entire conspiracy. If this story of survival and justice touched your heart, like this video right now, tell me in the comments what gave you courage in your darkest moments, and subscribe to Grandma's Legacy, because every grandmother deserves to have her voice heard and her story valued. Each like is so important to help stories like mine reach other women who need to know they're not alone in their fight for truth. To any woman watching this who feels invisible, dismissed, or powerless, remember that the most dangerous person in any room is someone with nothing left to lose except their principles. At 70 years old, I've learned that it's never too late to find your voice, stand up to bullies, and change the world one act of courage at a time. Sometimes the cleaning lady knows exactly what needs to be cleaned up, and it isn't always the floors.